Good afternoon. We continue today with our lecture series on the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. And today's talk is about the Bolshevik policy to religion and to the church. This is also based on my book, Russia After Lenin, Politics, Culture, Society. So it's about religion and the church. Now, the starting point is that the Bolsheviks regarded any religion as an enemy. They were atheists. Basically, the Marxist-Leninist doctrine specified that religion, as Marx put it, is the opium of the people. So from the Bolshevik perspective, it was pretty much obvious that religion was an obstacle. But they didn't do much, or not as much, as against other opponents, because they were so busy with fighting the whites and the peasant rebellions and the foreign intervention. It's only after the end of the Civil War that they finally showed all the elements of their anti-religious and anti-church policies. For the Bolsheviks, the church was obviously an enemy, but it was similar to other enemies. Basically, for the Bolsheviks, the church and religion, in this case, they're both in the same camp, are competition. That's what the church is. It's competition for the minds of people. From that point of view, it's similar to other kinds of competition, such as the organized political parties of the socialist revolutionaries, of the Mensheviks, and of the liberals, those that remain still in the among the liberal intelligentsia. So the church was the competition. But of all the competition that they faced, among the workers, for example, there was still Menshevik influence, and among the peasants there was still SR. From the Bolshevik point of view, the church and religion was the most serious and the most difficult competition. Why is that? Well, they regarded this basically just a very practical point of view. What did the church have that others didn't? It had pretty much everything. From the Bolshevik point of view, the church had ideology, which means a coherent set of ideas and values that they could convey to the people in a way that was better than anybody else could, because they had experience, they had a network of churches, they had buildings, they had, from the point of view of the Bolsheviks, that would be, they had organizational structure. They had the patriarch, they had the bishops, they had the village church, they had the village priests. So they had an organizational structure. On top of it, they had the physical structure, which means they had thousands and thousands of churches, buildings all over Russia, in every single town and in every single village, so that they could reach the people in a way comparable only to the Bolshevik party, or even better, because the Bolsheviks were very weak in the countryside, but the church was the strongest on the countryside. And if you have 90% of the population that are peasants, and all of them are believers, and all of them could be reached very quickly through their churches, from the Bolshevik point of view, it meant that the most formidable opponent for the minds of the people was the church. It had ideology, structure, network, proximity to the people, buildings, valuables. They had rich valuables from the point of view of the Bolsheviks. They had the diamonds and the icons and all kinds of things. But most importantly, they had income. Every peasant paid voluntarily a few kopecks into the church coffers when they came to the church. So this was been a big problem from the Bolshevik point of view. Now, of course, they exaggerated it. The church was not an enemy in a political sense. The church was not even an enemy of a political power, because the church in Russia has accustomed itself to put up with any political power that comes to power in Russia. They were an opponent of the Bolsheviks and of the atheistic ideology, but not really an enemy. They were not calling on the peasants to rise to rebellion and overthrow the Bolshevik regime. They did not do that, unlike the SRs, the socialist revolutionists, who did, also among the peasants. So it is somewhat unfair from the Bolshevik side to call them a political enemy who wanted to overthrow the Bolshevik regime. They did not. Nevertheless, they were a formidable opponent. And like any opponent, from the Bolshevik point of view, it had to be destroyed. It had to be smashed. It just couldn't be tolerated. Anybody couldn't be tolerated. And as we have seen, they've been harassing all political parties, arresting them, making lists, rounding them up, putting them in jail, in the camps, and so on, because the Bolsheviks basically did not want any political opposition. But now it extended to the point they didn't want any ideological opposition. They didn't want the church to be a competitor of a serious, in a serious way. So, what are they going to do about it? Let's start with income. The first thing that needs to be done is to deprive the church of its income. And that means that you have to open up a propaganda campaign to make people go to the church less and less. That means that you have harassment of all kinds, you have propaganda, you have created the committee, the committees of virulent atheists, as they were called, who would go and agitate among peasants that this is all a lie, that the church spreads all kinds of nonsense and lies, that this is opium of the people. In other words, you have a full-scale campaign, and the Bolsheviks are really good about organizing political campaigns that people stop going to the church. And some did. In fact, it became sort of a bad tone to go to the church. Are you going to the church? They would ask in all kinds of workers' meetings, and the politically correct answer would be, no, I don't. And some people did, and particularly it was women who remained loyal to the church, and particularly peasants. But again, there was indeed, the Bolsheviks succeeded in making the number of churchgoers diminish. The next thing they do is hit them on the income, is the plain robbery. This is the campaign of 1921-22. This was pretty much a campaign to confiscate church valuables. This is what it was called. Under the pretext of helping the starving people in the Volga region, and indeed there was famine that the Bolsheviks actually were responsible for with their requisitioning of grain, but nevertheless now they have this requisitioning of church valuables. So that is an incredibly interesting moment where enthusiasts and activists and Komsomol and young communists and Cheka secret police would actually go to the churches and literally rob them. I mean, literally confiscate without any compensation or any actually serious lists the valuables that the church had, and especially icons, which really amounted to mass theft of valuables, which were then sold abroad for whatever price there was, sometimes in bulk. This was a massive destruction of Russian national treasure and Russian national cultural heritage. There was a case in my own experience that in one of the many years ago in one of the churches in America, I saw a beautiful Russian icon and I recognized that it was very valuable. That was a Vladimir school of icon painting, and I asked the priest, where'd you get that? Well, he told me that his grandfather bought it for very, very cheap in 1922. So that sort of made me think that that must have been one of those icons that was sold en bulk in 1921-22. In any case, the theft of the resources, the attack on the income. Now about the buildings. The church had huge number of buildings, a lot of buildings all over Russia, obviously in every city, in every town, in every village. So what you have now in the 1920s and especially in 1930s is this campaign of destruction of church property. And literally, they would burn, if they were wooden, they would burn churches. Many times they would be simply confiscated from the church and turned into whatever storage facilities, stables. In Yekaterinburg, one of the most beautiful cathedrals for a long time was turned into stables and then into storage facility. In many cases, they were simply blown up, and the most notorious case was the blowing up in 1931 of the Church of the Christ the Savior in the center of Moscow, which has now been completely rebuilt. In the 1990s, it was restored and rebuilt from scratch. But this is a famous moment when one of the most famous churches in Moscow itself was blown up. So destruction of buildings, the hitting of the income, the theft, all this was practiced on a wide scale. But also there was another part of this campaign against the church, which was, of course, propaganda and campaign in the press. One of the things that the Bolsheviks particularly were afraid of is the proximity of the church to the people and proximity of the village priest to the people. And so what they tried to do is to create all kinds of what today would come as harassment, and harassment from the innocent one to the deeply offensive one. By the innocent one, I know in many cases from the archives that the Komsomol, the young communist organization, guys and girls would come to the church and release sparrows into the building, or they would do other things, basically to harass the believers and the church. And I call it innocent compared to more offensive ones. And the one that really stuck in my mind was an incident that I read about in the documents in the archives, is that in one instance, a Komsomol member came to the church and said publicly that the church claims that there are miracles and that if you don't follow the church, you would be punished. And he said, now I'm going to do something and you will see I will not be punished. So he took his cigarette butt and came up to the church, to the icon of Jesus, and poked Jesus' eyes with his cigarette butt. And he said, you see, now I offend your so-called God and nothing is going to happen to me. So these are the kinds of things that the Bolsheviks did to attack the beliefs of the Russian peasants in ways that were quite offensive to most of them. Now, of course, it should also be mentioned that there was simple, plain persecution similar to the mass arrests of the Mensheviks and SRs and other revolutionaries. The priests were no different. They were seen as agents of alien bourgeois ideology, because it's nothing to do with bourgeois, it's just the way the Bolsheviks referred to it in their political vocabulary. So hundreds and thousands of priests were arrested, charged with anti-Soviet propaganda, and that's what they believed they were doing, and put in concentration camps, essentially in the Siberian camps, with tens of thousands. At this point, the numbers were in the tens of thousands in the 1920s. So mass arrests, destruction of churches, all these things, insults, harassment was going on. But this was not enough. They also had to hit at the structure of the Orthodox Church, and that is what they also tried to do by their favorite Bolshevik method, which means to split. I mean, the Bolsheviks knew how to split anything. They themselves split the Social Democratic Party into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. So now they had this idea that the Russian Orthodox Church has to be split as an organization, and they created their own, it was called renovationist church. Fortunately, one of the greatest finds that I have in the archives was a secret police report, the Chekhov report, to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and it was only allowed to be read to the Politburo members, as it was a secret report about the achievements of the Chekhov, of the secret police, in their campaign against the church. dated 1923. And it was a very detailed report that described all kinds of things that they so-called accomplished in terms of liquidating this and blowing up that and the closing number of churches and the rest. But also, one part of it was devoted specifically to what they call infiltration of the Orthodox Church. They had names and lists of of priests who agreed to cooperate with the Bolshevik authorities and who were also part of that renovationist church. Essentially, the only purpose of that renovationist church was to split the Russian church into two organizations that wouldn't be subordinate to the patriarch. In fact, that document had an interrogation of Patriarch Tikhon in the proceedings or in the minutes of this document, and it just there's tedious questions that Tikhon had to answer and try to defend himself against all these charges. Finally, the question has to be answered, did it have any effect? To what extent did the anti-religious, anti-church Bolshevik policies and propaganda affected the Russian peasants? The answer, of course, is a complex one, because indeed the number of believers has reduced in the Soviet years, and especially in the 1920s and 30s. And in some instance, one could be said that yes, the Bolshevik propaganda did play a certain role, a destructive one, in reducing religiosity of the Russian peasants and the Russian people. On the other hand, they couldn't and they didn't succeed in the most important ones, because the Bolsheviks looked at religion as an ideology. And religion, of course, is much more than just an ideology. The Bolsheviks tried to show to the peasants that the so-called miracles wouldn't work. So they would come to the village and say, see, you believe in this sacred icon, and the sacred icon doesn't produce any miracles. And that was supposed to convince the peasants that it doesn't work. Or they would come and say, this is a sacred well, this is just lies by your priest, there is nothing sacred about it. So they were quite primitive in the way they would argue. In the 1920s, there was very famous incidents of public debates between the Bolshevik ideological workers, as they were called, and the priests. And after a couple of these debates, well, more than a couple, there were several that I discuss in the book, and it showed total incompetence of the Bolsheviks. They cannot argue with the priests. The questions were about resurrection, about salvation of the soul, about morality, about higher calling, about all kinds of things that the Bolsheviks, in their primitive materialistic ways, just didn't have any answers. And in that sense, the church scored a major victory. Because they still kind of conveyed their message that some things cannot be explained rationally, that something in your soul cannot be simply turned around in a couple of propaganda campaigns. So one could make a conclusion that in the long term, the church won. I mean, the church is still there. The Soviet power collapsed. The Communist Party collapsed. The Soviet regime, the Soviet Union, everything collapsed. But the church didn't. In fact, now it goes through one of its most brilliant revivals. There are churches built all over Russia. The Cathedral of the Savior in Moscow has been totally resurrected from ashes and is now the main church in the Russian Federation. The number of believers is growing, and it is one of the only European countries where the number of believers is growing, perhaps also Poland. So Russian church has withstood this onslaught of unbelievable attack that happened in the 1920s and 30s. It had regained, it preserved, it persevered in the 1960s and 70s, and it came back with a big revival in the 1990s and now. Thank you.